Get ready.
A couple months ago, I happened upon former blogger Richard Terrell. He kept a blog where he would make up all these different terms for trends he spotted in video games. At first glance, it seemed alright, and upon digging deeper, I see how he's got this well-constructed ecosystem of terms living and hanging out with each other. Richard himself will admit that it's got some rough spots, but on the whole, it's a useful way of thinking about games. What follows is my application of his ideas to Space Harrier 2. I've tweaked but a few of his ideas based on my own opinions and input from the larger Terrell posse, but the spirit of his ideas remains. First, we've got the player side of things. Mechanics, which covers how the player can interact with the game, and interplay, which studies how deeply those mechanics influence the game. Then there's the game side of things. Variation, which covers the range of unique scenarios the game can present the player, and Counterpoint, which discusses ways of juxtaposing variation. Of course, the game means nothing without a player, and the player means nothing without the game, so these two halves of commentary are necessarily linked. Additionally, the commentary here is limited to Richard Terrell's 101 essay series. One final note. Bear in mind that these are just terms Richard Terrell made up for their utility. He's just looking for the most useful set of words to talk about trends in games. So, when he asserts that a Goomba falling into a pit isn't a mechanic, well, it's totally a mechanic. But, to buy into the Richard Terrell ecosystem, you're gonna have to accept that it's not a mechanic by his rules. Once you do that, though, it's worth it. Anyway, enough yammering. My friend Justin A. Game just got back from video game conference I just made up 2014, and he asked me what a mechanic was. So I said, oh, I don't know, it's any working part of a video game. Like in Super Mario Bros. When players make Mario jump, a Goomba falls into a hole, or coins are put in a risky area. Those are all mechanics. Justin's not a smart guy, and the joke kinda went over his head. So, anyway, he went on to explain his opinion on that definition, and then proposed his own definition of mechanics. Mechanics are the player-initiated actions from controller inputs as designated by the game designers. These actions have effects on the game state in terms of variables and dynamics of the gameplay system. So this leaves out stuff like navigating a menu in turn-based combat, and, we can debate whether or not the mock ball in Super Metroid should be a mechanic, but that's not really in the scope of this discussion. There's no mock ball in Space Harrier 2. So, like in Space Harrier 2, you've got two mechanics. There's flying, which moves you around the screen, and then there's shooting. You can tally the number of mechanics in Space Harrier 2 using 2 digits in binary. And I should also mention, a mechanic's properties describe the resulting effects of that mechanic. For the flying mechanic, you move so many pixels per frame in the direction designated by the D-pad. A combined horizontal and vertical input triggers 2 moving mechanics at once. So if you press up and left, you are using the upward flying mechanic and the leftward flying mechanic at the same time. For the shooting mechanic, Harrier spawns a shot with a fixed vector, always the same speed, and always the same direction, straightforward. You can't have more than 5 Harrier shots on screen at once. After 5, shooting just doesn't work until one of the shots despawns. Justin also introduced me to 4 criteria for understanding a mechanic's role in a game. I got the sense that these weren't hard and fast rules, but rather some things he found useful for putting a mechanic in context. First, you got the criterion of individuality. Does the input yield the same action every time? Or can the input result in a variety of different actions? Or, as I understood it, how many different actions there are for an input. So like for moving, it's pretty easy. During gameplay, the D-pad only controls moving. And it's the same way for shooting. The A, B, and C buttons only control shooting during gameplay. Up next, the criterion of intuitivity. Intuition. The criterion of intuitiveness. That's a measure of the degree to which input method matches the form of the game. Or, as I understood it, how closely the input method matches the presentation of the resulting mechanic. This means you also have to account for things like how mechanics work in a game world, since that's part of the presentation. Like, does it make sense to walk in this context? Does it make sense that you can cancel this action into this mechanic? So on, and so forth. For the flying mechanic, the D-pad points in the direction that Harrier moves, so that makes sense, right? However, he can't move after he gets shot, or if he's tripping, and he'll only move within the bounds of the screen. I think those both make sense though, since I can't do much with Harrier if he's outside of my TV screen, and, you know, that would where would he be? And anyway, I don't expect him to move if he's shot down or off balance, so it makes sense I can't control him in that case.
Get ready.
For shooting, there's no way to vary its direction or speed, so there's no way to modify your input. Additionally, there is no feedback that tells you when you can shoot and when you can't. That is, nothing tells you that there are too many shots on screen. You just have to know that 5 is the max. On the other hand, it makes perfect sense that you can't shoot when Harrier is hit or tripping. Harrier falls backwards or loses his balance in these states, so the game's presentation pretty clearly indicates that he's not going to be able to fire a blaster in the, that wouldn't be very safe. And then, the criterion of directness measures how the changes in your input are paralleled by the form of the mechanic. Or, as I understood it, if you change how you perform input, how closely the presentation of the resulting mechanic mirrors that change. In flying, Harrier always moves at a fixed speed, and he will only move when the player is pressing the D-pad, so movement is always one-to-one with what the player is doing on the D-pad. If you change input, he's going to respond instantly. That said, Harrier can't move when he's hit or tripping, and he can't move outside the screen borders. He'll ignore your input in those cases. Shooting is pretty much one-to-one with how you press the shoot button. Just press it and he fires a shot. There are instances where it's not one-to-one, but I've already gone over them, like when you're tripping, or when you've gotten hit.
Get ready.
No matter how you perform the input though, it's always the same shot. And last, but not least, the criterion of dynamism measures how the game world responds to the action. According to the form of the game world and the mechanic, does the world react realistically? Or, as I understood it, this is how the game world responds to the mechanic. The world actually responds a lot when Harrier flies around. When Harrier flies, enemy shots and certain enemies will track his position, so moving will influence enemy behavior. But it goes beyond that. When Harrier moves, the camera perspective shifts relative to Harrier's position in 2 ways. Horizontally, the vanishing point goes to the opposite edge of the screen. The vanishing point moves left if Harrier moves right, and it moves right if Harrier moves left. Vertically, the vanishing point goes to the same edge of the screen as Harrier. The horizon line moves up if Harrier moves up, and it moves down if Harrier moves down. As for shooting, Harrier shots themselves have an element of dynamism in that they bounce off of invincible enemies and boss segments, making a cling sound. Or, if a shot kills an enemy, it makes a sound, followed by an explosion and a dust cloud that whizzes by along with the rest of the game world. Bosses also utter a wet sound when they get damaged by a shot. Alright, that's it for mechanics. I had some trouble getting these mechanics together though, without laying down some groundwork prior. This meant listing Harrier's various potential states and the classes of objects he could interact with. You can see my detailed notes here. There's the URL. I'm not gonna say like http://dub. So one day I was playing Space Harrier 2, and Justin A. Game asks me, "Is there anything neat about the interplay in Space Harrier 2?" I paused to think. Then Justin said, like the back and forth interaction between two game elements that is furthered by game mechanics? Yeah, I know what you mean, Justin. It's just that I don't think Space Harrier 2 has much interplay worth noting. If you think about it, the mechanics set a context for what you might consider to be interplay. So, let's look at the mechanics of Space Harrier 2. If I fly Harrier into an enemy, he dies, and that's the end of that. There's no back and forth. And if I get Harrier to shoot down an enemy, that's that. The enemy dies without any back and forth. Even in boss fights, bosses don't change their behavior when they get shot. They just accumulate damage until they blow up. Technically there's interplay, just it only goes one action deep. So, interplay. Justin A. Game was watching me play Space Harrier 2. I don't know, I don't really question what Justin does with his spare time. Anyway, he gets out this transparent film, like the stuff you use in an overhead projector, and starts drawing on it with a dry erase marker. I don't really care so long as he doesn't get any marker on the couch, but then he puts the film on the TV screen. And this is what I see. And before I have time to tell him to take that junk off the screen, he says this. The minimum difference is the smallest degree of change needed for a change to be significant to a mechanic. It's not an objective figure, it's just where you choose to start an investigation. With that in mind, I'd like to use this grid as a way of visualizing the minimum difference between enemy flight patterns. As you're dodging enemies, you tend to hang out in these 9 general areas. It's not specific, and it doesn't help us out with the randomly placed trees and bushes. But if you plot the joints of an enemy's flight path in these boxes, that tells you a good bit about the enemy's behavior. You also need to take into account how the enemy interacts with the foreground and background. For instance, can the enemy hit Harrier if it exits through the foreground? Does the enemy spawn in the foreground or in the background? Well, it's funny you say that, Justin. It's almost like I wrote that and then just put my words in the mouth of some imaginary character. But that would be a lot of trouble to go through for not much payoff. Anyway, I decided to humor Justin and plot the enemies as I saw them. For 2 enemies to be considered different, or meet the criteria for minimum difference, their flight path must be unique by at least 1 elbow, where each elbow is plotted on the 3x3 grid. Watch the enemy shadows as they hit the red dot. The shadows go through the very bottom of the screen, meaning that the enemies will collide with Harrier on that frame. Sometimes it'll look like an enemy is close enough to hit Harrier, but unless that shadow is all the way at the bottom, he's safe. In the future, I will color a dot red if an enemy can touch Harrier at that point. Although, if I do this for future levels, I might have to change that rule for the levels where you get a lot of red. I'll also leave a dot hanging off the edge if enemies fly off the screen by that border. This path highlights how hard it can be to plot these points given Space Harrier 2's shifting perspective. Here, I've tried to put them where you would position Harrier to shoot down the enemies. Also note that these enemies do not fly forward far enough to touch Harrier. They turn around at the green point, stopping just 1 frame short of it. And, just as a general note, bear in mind that Harrier's shots will not line up with the checkerboard floor. You would think that this flight path makes these enemies a cinch to kill, right? For that first line, they hang around at the very bottom and don't move far on the x-axis. However, because they don't move far on the x-axis, this path is dangerous. But think about it. Harrier himself is obstructing your view of anything directly ahead of him, and in order to shoot down enemies, you'll have to put Harrier directly in front of them. Remember, he can only shoot straight ahead. If enemies don't move on the X or Y axis, then Harrier will spend more time obstructing your view of them. During this time, they might be spawning shots that you can't see because they're smaller off in the distance. It's more to your advantage to have a spot where the enemies will fly by quickly. You can pick them off with shots as they fly by, and if you miss, at least you won't be blocking your view of them for long. I'm not sure what this says about variation. I feel like I should have reached some conclusion about the points that the different flight patterns hit. Well, it's at least worth noting that, in case you haven't noticed, enemy flight patterns are commonly mirrored horizontally. Justin A. Game and I were hanging out at this piano recital when he starts humming. Quite loudly, I might add. I ask him, keeping my voice low so as to be polite, I ask him if he could stop humming. "Aren't you curious what I'm doing?" he asks. "No," I say, but he goes on anyway. "I'm creating counterpoint. That's when 2 lines of music overlap. There's the line created by the piano, and there's the line created by my humming." So I roll my eyes, and Justin continues, "Hey, doesn't that happen in video games? I bet you it happens in Space Harrier too." It was at that moment, right after I had the inspiration to throttle Justin's throat, that I realized he was right. Space Harrier 2 will often have 2 enemy squads flying around on screen at once, and it's like each squad is its own line of music. That's because each squad follows its own path, and you've got to follow both paths at once. Or heck, even if you've just got one enemy squad, and then a bunch of random bushes, it's like the enemies are one line of music, and the bushes are a different line. You need one strategy to deal with the bushes, one strategy to deal with the enemies, and you need to take both strategies into account at one time. Combining those strategies is like combining lines of music. You get a whole new gameplay scenario, and a whole new bar of music. With that in mind, in Space Harrier 2, it's to your advantage to reduce counterpoint. The more enemies you have hanging around at one time, the harder your life will be. It's easier to handle one layer than multiple layers after all. So if you kill all the enemies in a squad, you have one less line of opposition to worry about. You don't have to divide your attention as much. So check this out. In this wave, I'm already hanging out at the bottom to blow up all these bushes, and an enemy squad flies in along the bottom, right where I'm already firing. So it's like the one line, the bushes, lead right into the next line, the mecha aidences.
Get ready.
But on this part, if I'm focusing on the trees, I'm not going to get those mecha aidences as soon as I can. Even assuming I have the level memorized, and I know exactly where the mecha agencies will spawn, I'll still have to choose if I want the trees dead or the mecha agencies dead. In this case, the two lines conflict. I also want to mention that, I already had some words made up for this. I like thinking of Space Harrier levels like, poems. Each individual scenario is a line of the poem stage. Each foot of the line is one of the squads. So a group of mecha agencies would be a foot, or a bunch of bushes would be a foot. And then, each individual enemy would be a syllable on that foot. But then, it turned out referring to squads as feet and enemies as syllables and scenarios as lines made me sound goofy.